To survive in the corporate world and the media world, you need resilience. NBR columnist Rachel Smalley examined this in her latest column, and she joins me now.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thanks. Now, resilience. Why this topic this week?
It's a really interesting topic to me, and it's something that I think as a journalist, when you go about, your career, you come across people who have resilience a lot, and that's driven by trauma or natural disaster or a myriad of different reasons. And it's something that I've always been, I guess, in awe of. And more and more, though, I feel, and particularly in the wake of COVID, I don't know whether we've lost our way a little bit, or whether we're developing resilience, or whether we're teaching resilience, I guess. And I'm always intrigued by it because I don't know whether we've started to move a little bit too far away from it, rather than sort of sitting, as I say, with the uncomfortable, which is where the growth comes, which is where the resilience comes from. I wonder whether we're sort of a bit too inclined these days to kind of step away from things that make us feel uncomfortable and maybe fuel anxiety.
Can you give me examples of that?
I guess in the workplace it's an interesting space, and I over the last 2 or 3 years, one thing that COVID has taught us, I think, is that you can't plan for the future, and that makes a lot of us uncomfortable, I think, and I think we're seeing an increasing sort of allowance, if you like, to say to people, have a mental health day, take some time out, and that's really valid in some circumstances. But I think when sometimes we just get pretty uptight and pretty on edge about things, or we just don't feel comfortable, I think sometimes we tend to fall away a little bit, if you like, and fall back on our laurels a little bit. I wonder whether we need to lean in and whether we can try and help coach people or guide people to get a bit more comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. I think it's just a natural thing that we all feel, and gradually you build resilience.
You've had some personal experience of this and some advice from a therapist. Can you share?
Yeah, sure. So, every now and then I bounce in and out of a therapist when I need a bit of help, I need a bit of support to kind of negotiate my way through things. And she's brilliant. She's great. And whenever I sort of get into a space where I'm feeling a bit uneasy or a bit uncomfortable, she's like, sit with it. When you're feeling uncomfortable, this is where you kind of understand more about yourself, and this is where you start. This is where the growth comes, she says. And I think she's taught me a lot about that, because I'm always, I sort of joke that I'm, why do I pay someone to make me feel uncomfortable? But actually, when you come out the other side and lean into your anxiety a little bit, or lean into something that you feel uncomfortable about, that's where you move through and move on. And I think sometimes, and she often has said to me, we've got to we tend to medicate, we tend to help people to move away from these things. And she said, I think we need to lean into it more. And I'm really mindful of that, I guess, now that, I have a 13-year-old son. And how do you, teach your resilience in children? And I've been lucky that some of the readings that have come through from his school have helped guide me on that. And I think some of those readings might be useful as well for the workplace.
Yeah, so what sort of challenges do you think this throws up for the corporate world?
Quite a few, because at what point do you pull back, or at what point do you encourage, say, an employee who's struggling a little bit? At what point do you pull back or push them on? Because, there's implications for this, right? And we are very focused these days on well-being and looking after staff. But if we aren't encouraging them sometimes at the right time to move through some of these things that are making them feel uncomfortable, then are we doing them a disservice? And some of the readings that I've had suggest, particularly when you look at children, when you focus on outcome rather than the journey, that's when you run into trouble. And if you focus on the journey, there's going to be hurdles along the way, and how are we going to manoeuvre and get around this? It's a bit like, when you've got an end goal, I guess, in your career as well, or, you're working on a project. If you're focusing on that outcome, when you hit hurdles and challenges along the way, it can discombobulate a little bit.
And do you think COVID has taught us more about resilience?
I think COVID's flushed out those who are resilient and those who aren't. And I think it's been quite a learning in that space, because, when we haven't really had, particularly with the Auckland lockdowns and the Auckland lockdown of last year, I mean, we We started to get less and less direction from the government. It was, we didn't quite know when it was going to be lifted. People didn't know when we were going back to work. There's lots of different rules and stages and phases and what have you. There was nothing that we could plan, and there was nothing really that you could sort of put into the future and go, that's where we're going. And I think towards the end, and I think this will show in time in our mental health statistics, that people really started to struggle with that. And when you don't have direction and you don't know and you can't plan, some people are really good in that space. Some people can roll with it and they can be, that great word, agile or pivot or what have you. Others are really thrown by it. And I think that's what COVID taught us. But I think certainly we've got space where we can build, I think, our personal resilience, and we can support particularly some of our young people in the workforce to develop their resilience as well.
Do you think there's a generational gap between younger, older, and dealing with resilience?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because when I look back and I think, I always tease my mum and I go, you boomers have got a lot to, answer for, raising the likes of, me as a Gen Xer. Because when I look at my son now, who's Gen Z, he has privileged life, to be fair. That's the reality. There's not much that troubles him. And I wonder where he builds resilience. And I look at the generation before him, millennials. Have they developed resilience to the same degree? They're an entirely different generation. I can't answer that. But I wonder whether Gen X are pretty strong, and I think boomers are pretty strong as well. Again, it comes down to personal experience. But I do think there is something of a generation gap to a certain degree. But I think it's beholden on our generation to help younger generations come through to build that resilience. You shouldn't have to have, trauma or drama or natural disasters to build resilience. We should be able to, resilience I think is a bit like a muscle. You've got to keep flexing it to develop it. So, I think it's beholden on us all to help the generations below us to come through.
Rachel, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.